The HOA thought they could fine me for something they never owned, bully me into silence and get away with it, just like they had with so many others. Instead, they lost their power, their money, and soon, maybe their freedom. My cabin still stands. My land is still mine. And the board? They're the ones paying the price. If they didn't know the limits of their jurisdiction before, they know them now. It was late on a Tuesday afternoon when I found the envelope in my mailbox, thin, official-looking, with the HOA's familiar embossed crest in the corner, the kind of thing you normally expect to contain a newsletter about trimming your hedges, or some overly polite reminder about community aesthetics. I almost tossed it straight into the junk pile, but something about the weight of it, how light it felt, made me stop. Inside was a single sheet of paper, and in bold letters across the top it read, "Notice of Assessment, $30,000. I actually laughed out loud at first, thinking it was some kind of prank, but as my eyes tracked down the page, the humor evaporated. The HOA, my HOA, was fining me $30,000 for construction of an unauthorized dwelling in violation of their building covenants. The so-called unauthorized dwelling was my cabin, a place I had built 5 years earlier, on a piece of land I'd inherited from my uncle, tucked deep into the Pine Ridge foothills nearly a mile beyond the HOA's jurisdiction. I could still remember the summer I built it, the long days staining cedar boards until my hands were splintered and raw, the scent of fresh lumber and mountain air, the satisfaction of knowing it was entirely mine. No HOA had been anywhere near it. The land itself wasn't even within the gated community. It was separated by a county road and technically under a different zoning district altogether. The cabin had nothing to do with them, and yet, here they were, accusing me of illegally expanding residential structures on HOA property. I reread the letter 3 times, scanning for some clue as to how they thought they could possibly get away with this. The more I read, the more I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was deliberate. They'd even cited sections of the HOA bylaws that only applied to properties within their boundary, and my address wasn't listed in their plat maps. That alone should have ended the matter, but buried halfway down the page in dense legal jargon was a line that sent a slow burn of anger through me. Failure to remit payment within 60 days will result in legal action, including but not limited to a lien against all real property owned by the violator. All real property. They weren't just threatening the cabin, they were threatening my home. My actual house, the one inside the community, where I lived. I set the paper down on the kitchen counter and stared at it, my hands trembling, not from fear, but from the kind of cold, calculated anger that doesn't explode right away. I thought about the HOA president, Richard Mallory, a smug, silver-haired ex-lawyer who'd been on the board for as long as anyone could remember, the kind of man who liked to remind everyone that rules are the glue that holds society together. He'd been gunning for me ever since I refused to join his little community improvement committee 2 years back. I thought about the time he'd tried to fine me for having unapproved exterior lighting, just because I'd strung up a few Edison bulbs on my back porch, and how I'd beaten him by producing the original architectural approval from before. I even moved in. He hated losing, and I knew, deep down, that this fine was his way of trying to settle old scores. The rest of the board? They followed him like sheep. People underestimated the HOA, thought they were just about lawns and paint colors. But I'd learned the hard way that these boards could be as petty and vicious as any political body. This fine wasn't about the cabin. It was about control, about showing me they could reach into any part of my life if they wanted to. But as I stood there, staring out the window toward the Pine Ridge where my cabin sat silent and untouched, I made a decision. I wasn't going to pay a single cent. In fact, I was going to make sure that by the time this was over, Richard Mallory and his entire board would regret ever putting my name on that letter. The first thing I did after cooling off was head down to the county records office, A squat brick building with flickering fluorescent lights that always smelled faintly of toner and old paper. I knew I needed hard proof, something I could wave. In the HOA's face that would make their $30,000 fine collapse before it even got started. The clerk, a wiry woman named Denise who had worked there longer than most of the county commissioners, greeted me with her usual deadpan, "What can I help you with?" I slid the letter across the counter and said, "I need every plat map, jurisdictional boundary, and zoning record for this area, especially for this parcel," tapping the coordinates of my cabin. Denise raised an eyebrow, skimmed the letter, and smirked. "They're trying to fine you for something outside their jurisdiction?" she asked, her voice carrying the kind of disbelief reserved for ridiculous gossip. "Yep," I said, "and I think they're serious." She disappeared into the back, leaving me alone with the hum of the copy machines. When she returned, she dropped a thick stack of maps and legal descriptions on the counter with a satisfying thud. "These should make them choke," she said, almost conspiratorially. As I flipped through them, my suspicion was confirmed. My cabin's land parcel had never, in any version of the county records, been within HOA boundaries. It wasn't even in the same taxing district. But then something curious caught my eye, a set of boundary amendment requests filed by none other than Richard Mallory himself, dated just 6 months ago, attempting to expand the HOA's reach to include a strip of land that, if approved, would have swallowed my cabin's parcel whole. The county had rejected the request, citing procedural violations and a lack of resident approval. That meant he had tried and failed to claim my land. And now, it seemed, he was pretending those rejections never happened. I left with certified copies of everything, storing them in a waterproof folder like precious treasure. Back home, I started digging deeper, combing through the HOA's own bylaws, minutes from board meetings, and even obscure newsletters that most residents tossed, straight in the recycling bin. The deeper I went, the more rot I found. Unapproved spending on executive retreats, fines issued without due process, and whispered allegations from past residents who had mysteriously moved out after disputes with the board. My phone started buzzing. Neighbors had seen me at the records office and were texting me rumors, half of them outraged, the other half scared. One even warned me, "Careful, Richard plays dirty." I didn't doubt it. By the following week, the HOA had escalated, sending me a second notice that was even more aggressive, this time hinting that they could instruct the sheriff's office to assist in property seizure if I failed to comply. That was laughable. They had no such authority. But the fact they were putting it in writing told me they were either desperate, reckless, or both. I called an old friend, Mark, who'd spent 20 years as a litigation bulldog before retiring to a quiet fishing life. I faxed him the letters, the maps, and the board's rejected boundary request. An hour later, he called back, his voice tinged with both amusement and disbelief. "These idiots just handed you a lawsuit on a silver platter," he said. "If you want to push this, we can bury them." I told him I wasn't just interested in pushing. I wanted to shove until their entire little empire came crashing down. That night, sitting on my porch with the faint smell of pine drifting in from the ridge, I realized something important. This wasn't just about my cabin anymore. This was about every homeowner they'd bullied into silence. And if I played this right, I wouldn't just beat them, I'd expose them. Mark didn't waste a second. By the next morning, he had already drafted a formal cease and desist letter to the HOA, demanding they withdraw the $30,000 fine and issue a written apology within 10 business days or face immediate legal action for fraud, harassment, and abuse of authority. We didn't send it quietly. We had it delivered by a professional process server, right in the middle of a public board meeting. The look on Richard Mallory's face, I'm told, was priceless. Apparently, his smug grin melted into something pale and twitchy the second he opened the envelope. But this was only the opening salvo. We filed a public records request for every fine, lien, and enforcement action the HOA had issued in the last 5 years, and the results were worse than I'd imagined. Dozens of fines issued against properties. Outside their jurisdiction, residents pressured into settlements without legal representation, and in some cases liens recorded without proper court orders. We compiled everything into a binder the size of a cinder block and handed copies to a handful of trusted neighbors. That's when the shift began. Whispers turning into outrage, outrage turning into open defiance. People who'd kept their heads down for years suddenly started speaking up, telling stories of intimidation, unexplained fees, and threats eerily similar to mine. One older couple admitted they'd paid over $15,000 to resolve a dispute that never should have been under HOA control in the first place. We gathered these accounts, notarized them, and built a case that went far beyond just my cabin. It was systemic abuse. When the board caught wind of our momentum, they tried damage control, flooding the community email list with warnings about misinformation and rogue residents attempting to undermine property values. It backfired spectacularly. Every word they sent only made them look guiltier, especially when a local reporter got wind of the story and called me for an interview. I didn't give her everything, just enough to plant seeds in the public's mind and make Richard sweat. By the time the HOA's lawyer, a jittery man who looked like he hadn't slept in weeks, called Mark to see if we could resolve this quietly, it was too late. We'd already filed our lawsuit, attaching not just the fraudulent fine against me, but 15 other cases of overreach, complete with certified maps proving the properties were outside HOA boundaries. We also included the failed boundary expansion requests Richard had tried to bury. The court date was set for 3 months out, but the real trial had already started in the court of public opinion. Richard stopped showing up to community events. 2 board members resigned for personal reasons. And late one night, while reviewing depositions in my home office, I spotted something in the meeting minutes from last year. A single, almost throwaway line about allocating funds for jurisdictional defense. They'd been planning this power grab for over a year, and now, with their scheme laid bare, all I had to do was make sure the hammer came down hard enough that none of them would ever try something like this again. The courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and tension that morning, the kind of tension you can feel pressing against your skin as soon as you walk through the doors. Our side of the gallery was full. Neighbors, former residents, even a couple of county officials who'd quietly told me they'd been rooting for this day. Across the aisle, Richard Mallory sat stiff in his navy suit, flanked by the 2 remaining board members and their visibly nervous attorney. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with a voice like gravel, wasted no time, calling the case and instructing both sides to proceed. Mark stood, calm as ever, and began laying out our evidence with surgical precision. Certified maps proving my cabin was outside HOA boundaries. Official county rejection letters for Richard's expansion requests. Notarized affidavits from 15 homeowners who had been fined illegally, and financial records showing the HOA had used those fines to fund board retreats and even pay for a luxury landscaping contract awarded to a company owned by Richard's brother-in-law. The judge's brow furrowed deeper with every exhibit, and I could see Richard squirming, tugging at his collar like the air had grown too thick to breathe. When it was their turn, the HOA's attorney tried to argue interpretative jurisdiction and community integrity, but the judge cut him off, reminding him that property rights were not a matter of interpretation. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for. Mark entered into evidence the meeting minutes where the board openly discussed targeting non-compliant outliers and testing boundary enforcement to expand their control. Minutes Richard had signed himself. The courtroom went silent except for the scratching of the clerk's pen. The judge leaned back, stared over her glasses, and said, "This court finds the HOA acted outside its authority in multiple instances, with intent to mislead and financially exploit residents. This behavior is egregious." She ordered the $30,000 fine against me null and void, mandated full restitution to every resident illegally fined in the past 5 years, and, this was the part that made my chest swell, referred the entire board to the district attorney's office for potential criminal charges, including fraud and conspiracy. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Richard's face drained of color. The board members avoided eye contact with anyone. As the gavel fell, I felt a wave of vindication unlike anything I'd ever known, not just because I'd won, but because the people who had hidden behind titles and rules to bully their neighbors were finally being dragged into the light. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, microphones thrust forward, cameras flashing. I kept my statement simple. This was never about just one fine. It was about standing up to abuse of power, and we did. In the weeks that followed, the HOA collapsed in on itself. 3 more resignations, special elections that no one wanted to run for, and ultimately a petition to dissolve the association altogether. My cabin remained exactly where it had always been, untouched and mine. Sometimes, when I sit on its porch and watch the sunset over the ridge, I think about that letter they sent me, and I almost wish I'd framed it. Not as a warning, but as a trophy, a reminder that even the most overreaching, self-important little empires can crumble, one truth at a time,